Hello. Good morning and welcome to the SBC 108, Governance for SharePoint 2013 customizations. We're going to be talking about applications for SharePoint, apps for SharePoint. My name is Oleg Kaufman, and here with me is John Epstein. We're consultants working, Microsoft consultants working in services. And for the last several months, we've been working with various clients on TAP and RDP engagements, observing how they plan to use SharePoint 2013, helping them, you, some of you here in the audience, actually design, deploy some of the solutions. We're developers at heart, moved to infrastructure a little bit over the years. And this talk is about applications for SharePoint and how do you govern them. Session objectives. We're going to talk about some of the decisions that you guys, IT administrators, developers, will need to face with new application development choices in SharePoint 2013. We will discuss some of the architectural strategies related to the lifecycle. How do you deploy them? How do you provision them? How do you acquire them? And hopefully we'll begin to start a conversation on how to evolve existing governance, because obviously at this point in time, with previous versions of SharePoint out there, governance by itself has been established, set of policies, rules for the SharePoint as a platform, SharePoint as an environment is in there.
So as Oleg mentioned, we're consultants, which means the first thing we have to do is set expectations. So there's a few things just to set expectations that we're not going to be covering. There's been a ton of sessions on this. One is how to build an app. There's a bunch of different ways apps can be built. Also, what apps can do. Apps can do a whole bunch of things, and if you start getting creative, you can probably do even more things. So we're not going to go into a deep dive of how to build them and what they can do. Lastly, we're also not going to talk about a huge amount of lessons learned from SharePoint governance. In terms of apps specifically, because obviously apps is a brand new model, and this is going to be a learning process for everyone. However, there is a lot of experience to be gained in terms of SharePoint governance as a whole. And as you'll see, one of the themes throughout our talk is that a lot of the ideas that you probably have set up for governance already apply directly to app governance. So, like we said, there's a whole bunch of sessions. If you have a time machine, you can go back and watch them live. If you don't, they'll be online. So this is an eye chart. Don't worry about looking at it now, but rest assured there's plenty to see when you want to build an app.
Here's the agenda for today. We're going to be talking a little bit about, we'll spend a few minutes talking about SharePoint governance as a whole. We will cover who actually should be in the room here, as well as when the governance conversation starts or continues in your company. What changed from going from Farm Solutions to Sandbox and now to apps for SharePoint? We'll be covering app lifecycle considerations, some of the details and gotchas there, and we'll proceed to review and hopefully answer some of your questions. What is SharePoint governance?
Right.
John.
So a lot of people probably have their ideas of what SharePoint governance are, and we just wanted to set a baseline before we go into a lot of the ideas. The biggest thing, and you'll kind of see this theme throughout, is you're going to have to strike a balance here. There's a lot of capabilities that apps can do. There's a lot of things you have to keep an eye on. It's the same with anything out in SharePoint governance. Your goal is basically to find that balance where you keep your IT folks happy, but your users happy. So a lot of these things are just to avoid confusion. We talk about the people. We're not just talking about, there's the users, there's IT folks, there's compliance. We'll talk about that a little bit. But then you talk about things like processes. And this is basically when someone comes to you with a request for something, or even you're trying to keep a hold of the farm. One of the important things to do is to make sure that you have a lot of these things set ahead of time. So that's another theme we'll have, is to try to set processes and policies ahead of time. And lastly, in terms of technology, keep in mind that when we're talking about SharePoint governance, and now especially in the app model, this is even more true, we're not just talking about SharePoint, and we're not just talking about, say, SQL and SharePoint. There's a lot of surrounding technologies, and when you get into the app model and you think about some of the hosting models, there's a lot of other technologies around. And when you start to go through and sit down in a room to figure this out, make sure you're not just looking at SharePoint in a bubble, but you're looking at collaboration as a whole.
So who actually should be in the room when these conversations take place? We've thought for a few minutes and basically try to cover a whole gamut of choices. From the very beginning, and keep in mind, again, as we're going through these slides, we're trying to refresh some of the memories related to governance of SharePoint as a platform and slowly show you some of the deltas that existed between 2010 and now with 2013 and specifically apps for SharePoint. So for example, when you look at the list of and groupings of some of these users, most of them, if not all, should have been present in normal governance talks and normal governance conversations even with previous versions of SharePoint. It now becomes a lot more important because when you look at, for example, let's start with business folks. Let's start with actual users who will be using the product. To them, the specific set of governance policies is not as important as the fact that when they go to the site is supposed to be up and running. So some of the choices that are made during the design and deployment of solutions coming from farm to apps for SharePoint, as you start covering higher stability and higher SLA numbers, they certainly going to be benefiting from it first. As you proceed down the line there, you obviously talk about and involve people from SharePoint community, SharePoint governance. Now you also start looking at folks who are deploying Office images, perhaps, because now the Office itself can actually include some of the applications. So whenever we talk about apps for SharePoint, it's no longer something that users can access only in SharePoint when they go there. These are apps that people can actually access when they open Word or Excel or Outlook. So these people now need to be involved in decision-making process as well. Folks who are in charge or actually dealing with some of the social requirements, because these applications now can become a lot more viral. You can acquire a lot of applications from SharePoint store if necessary, and so they just need to be aware of some of the trends and some of the activities, highlighting apps, reviews, ratings, some of those things. In the middle, you have, and by the way, this is in no particular order, DNS, right? So when you start talking about apps for SharePoint, all of a sudden you start dealing, and as other sessions have described, you start dealing with issues where you now have to go to DNS and actually configure wild masks or host records specifically just to host apps. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have not involved DNS folks before, because obviously SharePoint being the network application had to have a whole number of DNS-specific work. Bandwidth, cloud integration, these things now become more important as you look at Office 365, as you start looking at provider-hosted apps that are elsewhere. They're not in Azure, they're not in SharePoint, they may be PHP app running somewhere. It may be WebLogic WebSphere application that you'd like to integrate with.
So the one to emphasize, though, at least in our experience, the one that you always forget, I'm guessing most of the folks in here are IT, you probably got some developers, some people that are in operations, everything else. The easiest one to forget is the business folks, the users themselves, and actually that's the most important one to have in the room. So oftentimes you can go down and figure, I know what the users want to do, or I have a good sense of the users, I get all the calls. But as you're going down this, if they're not happy and they don't understand the processes, or they're trying to do stuff that you're not expecting, the whole thing's not going to work as well as you'd like. So make sure that you have, across your business org, so, HR, IT, research and development. Every enterprise is going to be different anywhere. Everyone's going to have different business users, but get a sampling from across. And Oleg, this is just a one-time conversation, right? This is...
Absolutely. We're just going to start it today and finish it today.
Right. So at the end of this talk, governance is done. You just show everyone this talk, you're done, right?
Right. Before we move on to the next slide, actually, just wanted to mention again on legal. Some of the interesting things that, or some of the things that before were only isolated to your SharePoint environment within the enterprise, where even if you're acquiring third-party applications, they still would be, from licensing perspective, this is something you bring into your environment. Now you start looking at acquiring applications from SharePoint Store, from Office Store, from vendors that may actually be hosting those applications elsewhere. So just like with other companies that have app stores out there, you now have to have people involved in licensing as well as some of the privacy controls and privacy limitations that need to be now reviewed. How does that particular app access private data for users? What does it do with that data? Where does it store it? So some of those questions legal folks should be able to control and answer. So governance needs infrastructure. This is one of those slides that is complex, and we kind of try to build it, and kind of, again, quick refresher. Keep in mind that these particular slides, the first 4 or 5 slides, they're really, as you see, they're not really about apps for SharePoint, right? Because, again, it's a governance thing. It's a set of policies and procedures. And as we go through, we're covering various teams and divisions. We have various departments and teams in those departments. We still deal with service level agreements. We still deal with operational level agreements from different services. With portal and collaboration services now, they need to concentrate more on either hosting those apps or make decisions on how to actually bring those applications from the outside. So just like before, if you didn't have Center of Excellence, now perhaps would be a good time to actually set it up. If you have such Center of Excellence, it would be a good time to have refresher and go through some of the new things with apps for SharePoint. You also need to now involve a lot more various technical services teams, because all of a sudden, while we go around and say that apps for SharePoint really not necessarily installed in SharePoint environment, they still are running in your environment, be it client-side code, be it access through STS to various provider-hosted applications, folks down in Windows Server, in storage, in Active Directory, all of those people still need to be involved. None of that really changed. As always, you have to have some sort of council that looks over the umbrella of services and proposes and establishes various policies. You also need to have, if you don't have that yet, some sort of a community for SharePoint administrators, perhaps, as well as for business analysts, to be in a feedback loop with all the other groups. And you need to have money. So here, Executive Steering Committee helps, obviously, acquire and controls what kind of vision and scope comes from it, and what kind of return on investment ultimately a company gets out of it.
So 2 big takeaways on this slide. One is the service level agreements. The more you can publish out, expectations, for example, when we talk about app requests and how do you get a hold of a new app that you want to deploy, the more you can publish out expectations to say, hey, we're going to review this, but it's going to take us 3 days to review it. I don't know how many of you, I've hit this 1,000 times, where you get everything is an escalation. Everyone says, I need this. Oh, by the way, I need it yesterday, and I need this deployed now. What do you mean you have 3 days to review it? If you can publish those expectations ahead of time, it helps a lot with those conversations. You're still going to have escalations, but it'll help. And the other one is the executive steering. The more you keep those folks informed, and the more you can get executive buy-in, the easier all these processes are going to be.
So let's move to meat and potatoes, right? What actually changed in the system?
So one of the bedtime stories I always like to tell my niece and nephew is the story of the developers and the 3 bears.
Developers?
Developers and the 3 bears. So we go back to Farm Solutions. This is a little bit of a refresher. But you've got full trust solutions. There were other ways to try to lock down Farm Solutions a little bit, but it was difficult, and everyone kind of went away from that. And you basically had everything that was going into the GAC, full trust solutions. And that was great. They were super powerful. You could do all sorts of different things, including take down your farm. So we decided that was bad.
And by the way, past time doesn't mean they no longer exist, right?
Absolutely. Right. So Farm Solutions aren't going away or anything. You can still do a ton of stuff with Farm Solutions. If you're in Office 365, that's a little different. But if you're Farm Solutions, they're not going away. But this is, if you're thinking of Goldilocks and the 3 bears, you've got, Papa Bear who likes his porridge hot, and Goldilocks tries it way too hot. Then you've got Mama Bear, and she tries her porridge way too cold. She likes it that way. Papa Bear likes it too hot. But Goldilocks can't do it. She gets to the child bear, which is not too hot, not too cold, and she's happy, right? So this is the exact same thing here. You've got your Farm Solutions, which in sometimes are going to be great and exactly what you need, and then you've got your SharePoint apps, which other times are going to be exactly what you need. So the model's changing a little bit. If you're developing, we're going to talk about kind of a thought process to go down. When might these be appropriate?
Hey, on Sandbox, I noticed something about deprecated. Can you talk a little bit about that too?
Yeah, so Sandbox solutions are deprecated. Now, there's probably a lot of panic They're not deprecated doesn't mean that they're gone, not yet. So if you're upgrading to 2013, your sandbox solutions, will still run. There's still an idea of sandbox solutions. However, they are going to eventually go away. So when you're planning, and every time you upgrade anything, you have to test all your solutions and everything. When you hit problems, the recommendation I would say is if you're in midstream on a project with sandbox solutions, we're not saying stop midstream, but if you're starting a new project, probably wouldn't do sandbox solutions because that's going to be something that in the end you're probably going to have to rebuild. And then over the next time until the new versions come out and sandbox solutions go from deprecated to gone, do plan to upgrade those. However, apps for SharePoint give you a lot of advantages that sandbox solutions don't. For one, they're very, very friendly. It's Office 365. So if you're in Office 365 or you're planning to go to Office 365 at one point in the future, this is the way to go. They're easier to deploy, easier to maintain, and probably most importantly, they're easier to reuse. So you've got this whole idea of an app catalog where you can more easily put these things out, distribute it to users, and let them choose what they want to use. Of course, there's no server-side code. And then one more that we even don't have up here that we'll talk about a little bit is you might even be able to recoup some of your investment on some of these apps. So there's that whole SharePoint store. So one of the new things that as you're doing custom development that you might have to think about towards the end of the development process is not just, is this ready to deploy? Who should get access in my enterprise? But also, hey, maybe this is something that someone else wants to use, and maybe we can publish this out to the SharePoint store.
And here's some of the necessary disclaimers. When we talk about easier to deploy, easier to maintain, easier to reuse, and no server-side code, you have to keep in mind that, and we'll go through details in a few slides on some of the specific hosting models. Apps for SharePoint are not what used to be, farm solution. You can't really directly map them one-to-one, right? Because ultimately, it can be a wrapper on top of some integrated solution that runs today in your enterprise that does have some sort of server-side code that has been already deployed, or it has its own SLA associated with that. So whenever we talk about it, keep in mind the context here is you have a SharePoint site or SharePoint environment, web application scoped, essentially, and you'd like to actually have some sort of solution in there that shows information or flows some sort of information from some other app or to some app. So in that sense, easier and no server-side code obviously apply to that area of the application. Let's talk a little bit about lifecycle considerations, and we're by no means done, so don't you worry. So when we start talking about development, right, or planning rather for application, we have some sort of business requirement, and we're trying to distill that business requirement into a collection of functional requirements. And at some point in time, an architect comes along and starts thinking of a particular technology or set of technologies to use. We've taken this slide from MSDN, and we thought it would be useful to show you a collection of various technologies. John, what do I use?
So there's a ton of choices, right? And it all depends on what you're building. But there is a little bit of a process if we're starting to go through thinking through what process you might follow to build one of these. So this is probably going to look similar to a process you might follow today with SharePoint solutions and full trust solutions. But there are a few extras in here. So we start out. Where do you start? The first place you probably want to start is, has anyone already built this? There's no reason to reinvent the wheel over and over again. Maybe with a few tweaks, you can make this more reusable. But I would say the first thing you want to do is check the app catalog. The other question, and maybe this is even a bigger question, is yes, there's no more full trust code. It's not running on SharePoint server. Life is great. Except if you can still do it without code, you still save some of those headaches. At some point, are you going to have to upgrade it? What happens if it's hosted somewhere else and that infrastructure changes? So if you can do this without code, and you probably want to go down that route. However, there's always times. So this might be a solution that 1,000 users are asking for, and you're going to have each user do this complicated process 1,000 times. Maybe you just build the code for it once and it's easier. But you really want to start there. And by the way, I would almost view this not just as a thought process thing to go down, but as you're approving apps and as you're going through, what is it going to take for me to publish out an app? I would actually make this perhaps you know, a guideline to follow, a checklist to say, have you checked the enterprise catalog when, you know, a business team comes to you and says they want to build one of these things? Have you gone down, as we go down the list, have you gone through these? If you haven't checked the enterprise catalog, go back to step one, because we don't just want to build things over and over again. Each thing you build has to be maintained.
And one of the interesting things, just from our own experience, and I've worked extensively with sandbox solutions in 2010 timeframe, and one of the things I've realized, and as I worked with the customer, because it's so easy to start building farm solution, the inclination in development teams, whenever a requirement comes along or whenever a project comes along, is to simply go down that road and basically just build everything using farm-based solution. Which is great, except they're not the ones operating such solution, right? And we all know what happens at the end of the day. So we found it kind of interesting and challenging probably at the same time to basically push the development team against the wall and literally tell them, you cannot build farm-based solution. Start building sandbox solution. It literally caused a little revolt, right? Because they came back to us and said, well, instead of X number of days, hours, years, it's going to take a lot more. And we asked why. And so they came back again and said, you know, gave us Excel spreadsheet and showed specific tasks and specific controls and specific functional informational items that they cannot implement using sandbox solution. We thought a little bit about that and said, you know what, for those items, go for it. Build farm-based solution. Similarly here, when you're going through this funnel, when you're going through this thought process, a process, you know, that you may actually hard code somewhere, you know, on the website with checkboxes and whatnot, push them against the wall. Push yourselves against the wall. There may be developers here in the audience that are thinking, you know, to app or not to app. This is the slide where everything comes together, and you really have to look around and say, do I bet on applications for SharePoint now as I wanted to bet for sandbox solutions, right? This is the time when you look at it and say, Microsoft, and I'm as guilty as charged in that too. Microsoft, 3 years ago, 2 years ago, you've proposed sandbox solutions. Now you're proposing app for SharePoint. Where's the guarantee that 5 years or 2 years, well, forget about 5 years, where a year or two down the road, I'm not going to hear rumblings about apps for SharePoint not being it, right? There are no guarantees. We can look at existing architecture. We can look at the existing information that's available to us as well, even though we are Microsoft, and make a decision and say, based on the information that we have today, here's what we would like to do. And if it provides us with best return on investment, quickest time, turnaround, and technologies and developers, then so be it.
I can tell you, though, that the product group is extremely excited about the app model. This is the new direction, so...
You didn't sound very excited. Say that again.
If any of you went to Ask the Experts, this is the new model. The product team is extremely excited. It's thought of cloud first, and so that's great. This is a model that is going to help protect the servers, give you a lot more flexibility, make use of server-side code without making use of SharePoint server-side code. So protect the farm, still give you the capabilities. So,
and at the very end of this funnel, by the way, we forgot to, well, we didn't forget. We run out of space there. There's one where if you actually, when we talk about publishing and we talk about public SharePoint store, you have monetization options now, right? So coming from ISV perspective, and even from a company whose core business is not necessarily selling apps, this is one of the routes today to actually go, as you build that app, look from cost perspective, and actually, if you can publish it and spend a few more minutes and hours and days polishing that app and making sure that it's actually useful across different disciplines, perhaps, you can actually push it out to a SharePoint store and start making money.
Which brings you back to that idea of we check the enterprise catalog, it's not there. Make sure you check the SharePoint store first. Everyone has a different idea of buy versus build. Depends on your enterprise. You might have the idea of we want to support it all ourselves. But I would check the SharePoint store just to see if you can save yourself a whole bunch of time and effort. Going down, you do have to go through the checklist of server-side code. As soon as you need something like a timer job, you're going to have to do it with a SharePoint full trust solution. But if you can avoid that, that's better. Also consider things. Is it really worth it to build this thing? Because, for example, if you're doing a provider-hosted app, you own that infrastructure. Who's going to maintain that infrastructure? Who's going to update it? Who's going to make sure it's patched? Everything like that. There's a lot more that goes into it when you think about a provider-hosted app or those sorts of things. So this is not simply a question of, okay, it's not in the enterprise catalog. A few people want this. I want to build it. It's also a question of, is it worth the investment that you're making? And oftentimes the answer is going to be yes, but you should still go through and make sure that you've answered that. And then lastly on here, you'll notice who owns and maintains it. I don't know how many people have gone through this. I've certainly seen it many times. Where you build something, those developers are gone. There's no investment to maintain it. Next time out, something changes. You want to upgrade it. No one knows how this thing works. And there's a whole big to-do of figuring out how do you upgrade this thing, how do you keep it up to date. So plan to figure out who's going to maintain it when you're building it up front rather than waiting until the problem occurs.
So here's an interesting exercise. If you took what we've just mentioned about this particular slide and this particular area, recorded all of that and tried to match it with the same conversation we would have in SharePoint 2010, would it be that much different? Probably not. We've used some of the new keywords, apps for SharePoint, provider-hosted models, a lot of those things. We've injected a few more things. We now start talking about SharePoint Store. We now start talking about App Catalog. By the way, we use Enterprise Catalog and App Catalog interchangeably here. It's the same thing, right? You now have ability to add those applications, but there's nothing really stopping you, even in SharePoint 2010, creating your own site, right? Adding items there, applications, and now pointing everybody to that and basically saying, look, these are our applications for that particular farm or enterprise, right? We will install it for you. There's more involved process, but ultimately not a lot changed in that sense. What changed is how you build those apps, perhaps, how do you deploy, how do you integrate them into your environment. And we believe there are options there that will be beneficial.
So Oleg, tell me, I have a whole bunch of users. This is this new idea of the SharePoint store. How do I control whether or not users can add stuff to the store?
That's a good question. Let me just find my catalog. So when you, I'm actually accessing a live SharePoint online site, and I'm the administrator and the Bear One owner of the site. And here's my catalog, and in that catalog, I actually can see different options here. I can distribute apps for SharePoint. I can distribute them for Office. I can also manage requests for apps. So one of the things that's important from governance perspective is choices that I need to make as an administrator of my farm, as an administrator essentially of web application. We'll go in details on actual heuristics of where it gets deployed and how. But ultimately, if you have App Catalog, you have two choices to make. One is, do you want your users to actually be able to access SharePoint Store directly and acquire applications directly from the store, or you want first to allow them browse that store, look around, and then ultimately arrive to the conclusion that, yes, we have something there, and but then they're going to actually have to ask you to acquire such application. So as an example here, I'm the user, I'm a regular user, I'm going to SharePoint Store, I look at my favorite application. Notice here that there's a button that says Requested. The reason that button shows up there and there's no button saying buy it or download it is because there are settings in the catalog that were set by the administrator to actually not allow me as a regular user with no permissions to actually acquire such application. Maybe it's because there's a licensing, maybe because there's a number of users that needs to be involved in it, general approval process. So what that process looks like, I'm going to go ahead and actually request it. As part of that request, it will be a question of how many users, pertaining specifically to licenses. There will be applications like Facebook, for example, that really asks that question but really doesn't care that much because I guess it's free. I can specify 100 users or request it for everyone in my organization. I can display justification. Social is important.
So this gives you a few opportunities to do things, right? If you're the owner of your enterprise catalog, first of all, you have a chance to review the app. Do we trust Facebook? Remember that when you host something on Facebook, the app's going to ask you for permissions. Do you want to give them those permissions? That means that Facebook can see data, depending on what permissions you grant. It also gives you the opportunity to take a look at the licensing model and figure out, do we want to pay for this? Do we already have this? Is it worth it? And then figuring out, well, 100 users, there's also the question of performance. Do we think we can support this? There's a lot of chit-chat back and forth. So there's a few different levels that you might want to take a look at depending on the app. And knowing the number of users, even if it's not a licensing question, is still a very useful question as you're figuring out if there's 100 users making use of this Facebook app, okay, that's not that big a deal for my farm. If there's 100,000 users that all want to make use of this, well, all of a sudden there's a lot more that you have to think about in terms of just how you're going to evaluate that app and what does that mean for performance considerations and bandwidth and everything else.
Absolutely. And as you saw, as I was going through different screens here, right now I'm accessing the site as the administrator. I'm going into the catalog. And in the catalog, I actually saw 2 different requests pending on the queue. One was for corporate news app, and another one for just submitted Facebook integration. I see the content market. I see the billing market. I see a number of seats. Who is requesting this app? I can click on edit. I can see more details about it, justification. I can click here to actually look at the details and decide. I can edit directly here, or I can simply state, well, add would be one option, and then here I would basically say go ahead and approve. I submit the comments. Right, and then I go to the app itself. I had it there, actually. And I add it to the site, so I would make it available. Well, I just need to log in there. Make it available to the users. How do I switch back?
Just minimize the browser there.
There you go. Whoops. I broke it.
So we're back to a little bit of developers and the 3 bears, right? So there's different hosting models. And as a developer, you're going to look at these hosting models and think about, okay, here are the capabilities of one versus the other. We really want to take a look at this briefly from a governance perspective. So what does it mean to allow each of these, or what does it mean when someone submits a request to you and says, I want to build an app? One of the things you want to do up front with folks is, and that's why we showed that slide of that SharePoint Center of Excellence, plan this ahead of time. Make sure that people are going through with you, the owners of your environment, whether it's a tenancy or whether in Office 365 or whether it's on premises. Make sure you think through this and you go through and get the justifications for why. So we started SharePoint hosted, right? All this means is you're getting a subweb. So that's pretty harmless, right, Oleg?
Well, let's think about it. Right? We're consultants. We have to come up with some complex scenarios. Let's say you have a number of let's quickly talk about SharePoint hosted sites first. And I know there were a number of sessions, and it's actually good that we're doing it on Thursday because you had a chance, hopefully, to hear some of the technical information, and we're kind of trying to stay somewhat high level. SharePoint hosted application simply means that whenever someone actually wants to deploy such application, a subweb is going to get created. Where that subweb gets created is a slightly different question, and we're going to go in a few slides talking about scopes. But ultimately, if web scope is created, you're going to have to assume that a subweb is going to get created in a particular site collection. Now let's imagine you have 100,000 users and you have 100,000 My Sites. Each one of those My Sites now needs to have a specific application that user obviously can't live without. So today, when you think about it from farm-based solution, you deploy that solution, let's say it's some web part. And that web part automatically becomes available to every user in every one of those site collections on the farm. With SharePoint hosted model, where application is deployed using SharePoint hosted, if you did not specify a particular tenancy, and if you simply left it as web scope, you just ended up creating a subweb for each one of those My Sites. So you've just created or just authorized, from policy perspective, creation of 100,000 subwebs. What if it's 1 million? Right, so these are some of the questions and some of the considerations would need to be kind of taken into account. There are options there. So SharePoint hosted is not necessarily bad or good. It's just something to keep in mind.
And it's not always as bad as it sounds. Sometimes this will make perfect sense. Sometimes it won't.
Make it sound bad. I just want to point attention.
So, Oleg, what happens if my developers all like C#?
God bless them. It's not really about the technology, though. It's not really about the language, right? We're really talking about ability for developers or ability for business to actually receive something that they want. So if that particular business requirement ends up being filtrated and funneled into a functional requirement that ultimately needs to be deployed and created as some sort of coded solution, that doesn't necessarily mean you can't use apps for SharePoint, right? You probably already have some sort of a farm or environment that allows for custom apps or custom solutions to be deployed anyway, right? So you could leverage that, or perhaps you want to integrate, let's think of integration projects, right? You have a whole bunch of applications, line of business solutions running in your company, and at some point in time, a request may come along that say, look, I've got a portal over there, and I want to expose CRM data, I want to expose reports, I want to expose whatever, from some application that has absolutely no idea about SharePoint. Right? What do? You build some sort of iframe solution, you pass some parameters into it, you receive some parameters from it. So, long story short, at some point in time, you basically build framework, which Microsoft called App for SharePoint, right? More or less. Provider hosted is precisely that. It's a model that allows you to actually rely on other solutions, not on other implementations running perhaps elsewhere. It may be completely separate SharePoint farm. It may be non-SharePoint installation altogether. There's a number of sessions, as we pointed earlier, that concentrated on building provider-hosted apps using Ruby on Rails or PHP, right? So you could envision that being essentially that loophole that allows you to escape into the world of, non-SharePoint applications, while at the same time allowing your developers basically utilize whatever skill set they happen to have. So if you have a strong team that specializes in PHP and they want to build specific application, or if they have built specific application, there's absolutely no need to start conversion of that into C#, event receivers, or whatever else that would need to be done in farm solution. Take that solution, make sure SLA is done for that properly to match somehow with SLA of the overall SharePoint immersive application that you're about to deploy, right? And we kind of continue stressing that point. Before SharePoint 2010 or even SharePoint 2013 with normal, farm solutions, it's all in your farm. It's all on your side. So whenever you talk about SLAs and OLAs, you really have one cube, one throat to choke. With provider-hosted model, you enable much more flexibility, but at the same time, you now have to bring SLAs and create this union of those SLAs and make sure that, if there's an application that has barely 97% uptime because it's just running on, on a small box and, in a desktop somewhere, and you all of a sudden decided to create provider-hosted application that exposes it as on the main page of your enterprise, right? Someone somewhere has to consider that and kind of understand that there will be object not found or some sort of stack trace in that little area of the site.
So if we can give you a quick checklist just to kind of think through, you're looking at provider-hosted model. What do you have to check? This is not necessarily a comprehensive list, but this is a place to start. One is disaster recovery and high availability. Can they offer you what you need? Another one is bandwidth considerations. Another one is who's going to maintain that environment, who's going to stand it up, who's going to pay for it. Is that environment going to go away in a year? Is that environment going to change entirely? These are things to look at. And then there's also the question of trust. Remember, you no longer are the one hosting this. This isn't SharePoint. So if I want to change what the app does or how it displays data or who it shares data with, once it gets a hold of that data, someone on the other side can change that. They own that hosting environment.
Well, John, I think we scared them enough. Let's bring them back into,
The point being, keep an eye on who's hosting it. Someone has to maintain that, and it does seem hard, right? So there is another third model that makes it a lot easier.
Yeah, and it's conveniently called auto-hosted, right? And auto-hosted, as the name suggests, there's something automatic about it. And automatic part means that whenever you actually deploy such solution, such application, gears turning somewhere in Azure, and you end up actually having Windows Azure website created for you in SQL Azure database. Both of them are provisioned automatically. SQL Azure database is going to be, 1 gigabyte in size? Mm-hmm. So at this point in time, you have an application in Azure that you can immediately start using. There are some considerations for that too. Can I use auto-hosted, for example, on premises without any access to the network? Of course not, because that obviously resides in Azure, Azure somewhere in Microsoft Data Center. There are circumstances, however, where you kind of think of a solution, right, and I have this isolated data center with absolutely no links to the outside world. You just decided, for example, that auto-hosted is not the right choice. From developer perspective, developer really is not going to care or know whether it's going to be that particular context, right? So when application request comes along, some of these things start playing a role in ultimately deciding, we go auto-hosted, we go provider-hosted, we go SharePoint-hosted. What if I want all three? What do I do then?
Hybrid.
We always have a solution.
All right. So let's talk about a little bit of development. So you go back to 2007 or even 2010 days, you wanted to do development. What did that mean? Typically, every developer, you give them their own farm. It means a VM. It's pretty expensive. You have to build the image for each one. That's a lot of work. So what changed, Oleg?
Well, you don't have to do it anymore, right? That's a good thing. Now, when you start thinking about it, you no longer need to worry about one VM per developer that contains a whole bunch of SharePoint stuff in it, right? You can now think from applications for SharePoint perspective, be it SharePoint or auto-hosted. You can actually have now shared farm, where a whole bunch of developers actually can easily utilize the developer side and do whatever they need to do there. There's no single answer here, right, where we can say, oh, you know what, from that point on, just forget completely about one farm. You never really need to worry about one farm per developer. However, there are some circumstances, and most of the times when you start looking at apps for SharePoint, you can step away from that paradigm, and you can actually deploy single farm or site per project and actually utilize it effectively with developers. No code means you can actually start leveraging some of these things. It's not just you saving on maintenance and whatnot. You're also saving on initial provisioning of environment and actually maintaining that environment throughout the development, testing, and deploying to staging and eventually to production sites.
So from a governance perspective, what does this mean? In the old days, when someone comes to you and says, I want to do a SharePoint development project, can I have access to deploy solution packages on your farm? Are you kidding? No, you're not going to give that away in production. However, now is beginning to change in the opposite direction of thinking through, well, I want to do this, can I have a VM? Why do you need a VM? You don't really need a VM. That's expensive to put together. Now, why don't I give you a developer site? You can do your development there. You still might have a staging environment and those sorts of things, but the difference is you have a shared environment as opposed to needing to build a farm and give everyone a VM and maintain all these images for each individual developer.
And again, if you think about it, right, every problem can be solved through one extra layer of indirection. So we just essentially pushed responsibility. If, let's say, there's a provider-hosted application somewhere, we just pushed responsibility from SharePoint to some other poor application, not even suspecting, right? So you have a bunch of developers all of a sudden pointing to some provider-hosted application that can be hosted even within your environment, but it never been designed for multiple developers to access and deal with, right? So all of a sudden, now they have to deal with it. So it's not necessarily that we're shifting the burden completely. No longer need to worry about one environment per developer. It's really all about SharePoint, so you just have to be very cognizant about it, and whenever conversations take place, just be aware of it. As we progress through lifecycle and as we arrive to publishing of such application, scope choice and scope decisions come into the picture. And I've sort of mentioned it before when I was talking about, extreme example of my sites with 100,000 and million sites. That's really what we were referring to here. You have two different scope models. You have web scope and tenant scope. And ultimately, as the title, as the slide suggests, in one case you have one site per instance, which again means you have 100,000 my sites, 100,000 site collections, 100,000 instances, 100,000 subwebs created for you. The other example is tenant scope, where you create one site per tenant. Now, tenant is a very overloaded term when it comes to SharePoint. Everybody immediately starts assuming multi-tenancy. Everybody starts immediately, there are warning bells kind of ring in the head saying, what are you talking about? I need to create a whole multi-tenant environment now for it. Not necessarily. You do need to deploy subscription service, subscription settings service. You need to deploy app management service, right, the typical services in the SharePoint farm. But at the same time, when you go to site settings, when you go to central admin, you now have choice there to configure tenant scope. And during that configuration, you can specify managed path. You can specify specific site template type that you want to deploy to. So you're no longer really in business of figuring out, I have 100,000 site collections, oh my God, I have to add each one of them manually to my tenant. It's more really about the initial, I'm going to go ahead and really plan to deploy an app or apps using tenant scope, and I'm going to point at the subset using wild masks and whatnot of sites that will receive such application. So when that happens, let me just finish it quickly. When that happens, the difference here, that particular subweb still gets created, but it's going to get created in one place in site collection where app catalog is provisioned. So when developers are thinking about developing their functionality, they're not the ones telling administrators how to deploy it. This is a very important distinction here. These settings, web scope and tenant scope, are not something that a developer can enforce. There's no setting in app manifest that says, you know, what's the type. It's not like the scope in the sense of solution where you can say I want it on the web application level, right, or site collection or subweb. These are options that are set during deployment of the application. So does it mean that a developer really doesn't have a choice here?
So this is the key point, is that you have options here, and you can choose to, as the person, once they submit an app to you and you're deploying the app for them, you can choose, do you want to have it web scoped or tenant scoped? And this is true, by the way, both for auto-hosted apps as well as for SharePoint apps. The big key is, do you want to share resources for every time someone goes to their site and says, I want to add an app to my particular site? Do they get their own, you know, SharePoint site, subsite underneath it, or is it shared? Or do they get their own auto-hosted, or is that SQL database shared? Right? And there's advantages to both. But what you have to think about as a developer, when they're building it, they have no control over this. However, if they build it in a way targeting one versus the other, the app might become broken or useless if you deploy it in a way that they're not expecting.
Or more useful other way around. Right?
So the key is, again, when someone's going to build this, try to get ahead of it and don't wait for people to come to you and say, you know, I have an app, I already built it, I'm ready for it. Try to set a policy where before they even start building it, they come and meet with your center of excellence, and they say, here's what I want to do, here's why, so that you plan this ahead of time and figure out, is it shared, what does this mean, so you don't run into these problems later on.
Let's talk a little bit about permissions. Permissions are important. It's security, right? It's control over data, privacy implications. What do we do there? So why do we have this little guy running and there's a plane?
So we keep talking about publishing things ahead of time. How many of you, you know, if you go to the airport right now, there's some expectations. You know that you're allowed to bring 2 carry-on pieces of luggage. You know that you're not allowed to have a gun in your suitcase, right? These are pretty set expectations. You're not going to be surprised if you go to the airport, you know, with a sword and they take it away from you or take you off to jail. It's very similar here when you think about it. When you're talking about things like app permissions, people are going to come to you and say, I want my app to do this, this, or the other thing, right? And what's going to be your evaluation criteria? One of the common things you'll see people do is just say, show me what your app is, I'll take a look, decide what it does, and then I guess I'll figure out whether or not I'm going to let you put it out there. The problem becomes everyone has a different idea. I look across the hall and can't figure out why the guy over there was able to get his app in with these permissions. I tried to do it, you reject mine, and there's a whole big to-do. So if you can figure out an evaluation criteria ahead of time and publish it somewhere and make it very objective so that people look at this and say, okay, you know, I'm allowed to have apps that are requesting web scope permissions, but if I want to have tenant scoped, I need to figure out why am I justifying that. All those sorts of things are going to be important.
Hey, high trust apps, what is that?
So high trust apps. This is an interesting one. I don't know if any of you have gone to sessions on this. This is really just for on-prem. This doesn't exist in the cloud. But for on-prem, you can have this idea of not just when an application asks for permissions and then it tries to access something, SharePoint looks at 2 things. This is the idea of OAuth. It looks at what the app is requesting permissions for. So I might say I want to be able to edit list items. Great. But in addition to that, it also looks at who the user is. So even if the even if the app has access to edit list items, if the user doesn't have access to edit the list items, it's not going to let you do it. Now, high trust apps is interesting because it changes that slightly. One permission you can request, and again, this is only on-prem, is to say, I want to just look at the app permissions. So it's almost like running with elevated privileges if you're a developer. Whatever the app has permissions to do, it doesn't look at the individual user. So if someone's requesting that permission, that means something different. And keep in mind, I don't know how many of you have ever installed apps, and as the individual developer, the individual site owner goes through and tries to add an app, they get prompted to say, hey, this app wants to have run of your site. Most people.
So what's with scrutiny? Why do we even bother actually mentioning it here? What's so right?
So most people are just going to get this, like a EULA and just say accept, I agree. This is why to plan it ahead of time. So the scrutiny is, again, going back to that idea of this site has the ability to access these resources. And if your provider hosted or hosted somewhere else, you potentially could have data leakage or those sorts of things. It's not that this means don't do provider-hosted apps. No, by no means. It just means take a look at who's hosting it, take a look at what they're asking for, and make sure that you feel confident in what's being put out there.
And from guidance perspective, if you think of different checkboxes and different checklists that would need to be created that trigger high-trust apps, when you look at the requirement that states we're going to access particular resource on behalf of individual users, then you know that high trust is really not necessary. But if the requirement states that a particular resource will be accessed independently of whether the user has permissions to it or not, this may or may not trigger some of the high trust apps. Or if you're in offline mode and you know in advance that your application is not going to be able to access ACS, right? Would that be a criteria too, for example, right? Having high trust apps requires a configuration upfront, and it requires, as the name suggests, much higher trust to that app. This was like an interesting loop on its own. One requires one. And what about upgraded apps?
Yeah, so the one thing,
we care?
When you're upgrading apps, there's a whole bunch. We're actually not getting into detail on what it means to upgrade an app. But you do have to plan for this because, for example, if you're changing the database schema or something, it can take time to upgrade all these different instances if there's a lot of data there. But in addition to that, they may ask for different permissions. So if I give you a quick update and say, hey, here's my new app, and you already reviewed it, you trust it, the new version might ask for new permissions. So again, it's that same model of, publish the criteria. If you're late to the airport and someone suddenly says you're only allowed one carry-on instead of two because today is Tuesday, that's going to cause a whole bunch of panic at the airport. So if you can get that out ahead of time and just say, hey, you're only allowed 2 pieces of luggage, you're going to save yourself a whole bunch of trouble.
And given that there's a fixed number of permissions available and visible and exposed, right, you can immediately start thinking of some sort of actual automated or some sort of process exposed to users where they can go and check, we're expecting these permissions, or from developer perspective, they can review and say, okay, well, if these permissions are requested, we have to consider slightly different hosting models.
So let's talk more about the app catalog. So I want to put one out there. What processes should I follow? How do I decide whether or not to approve an app?
So let's think about it. Going back to that demo that we showed with application request, you have to plan for some sort of service level agreement associated with that request. If I'm a user, if I'm navigating to a site, to SharePoint store, and if I'm seeing an application that I like there's this sense of urgency that must be present because I obviously found something that I like. If I click on it and then I realize, through some sort of message or through silence, that that request will take a whole month for someone to approve, there's some dissatisfaction level, and I may just lose interest for that particular app, and so I'm just going to go away and forget about it. There is some level of SLA that needs to be present there, and it needs to be planned in advance. You have to have someone, a team, a particular individual that will proactively go and review those requests, proactively go through SharePoint store perhaps, and actually decide in advance which applications are useful to the enterprise, to the department, to the division, depending on scope, and start adding them or approving them for users to actually start using, so that when users actually go to site settings in their specific site, they will find the application that they need, right? That's typical start problem when you open up iTunes, you open up App Catalog in Marketplace in Windows, Android, any one of those. You have large number of applications, and you may not necessarily know in advance what exactly you want, unless someone shows you highlighted, someone shows you higher ratings. That kind of work needs to be done here as well.
So notice two things, too. One is there's nothing technical about this side. When you're taking care of the app catalog and deciding what's out there, when you're talking about pruning and highlighting apps, this is a pure business thing. So this is no different than some of the problems we have today with SharePoint. If you have a site, I created a site. It's 3 years old. No one's using it anymore, and now it's just creating noise. Well, here, if I'm a user and I'm trying to figure out which app do I need for this piece, you're going to have a couple of things we want to prevent. One is you don't want to have 3 apps that do the same thing, and users have no idea which to choose. But another thing is you don't want to have apps that are broken out there or old. So someone's going to have to keep an eye on these all the time, and we'll show you there are some tricks to keep an eye on what's out there, the usage of apps and those sorts of things.
Right, and again, keep in mind, you go to SharePoint Store, you realize, you look at some of the applications and you realize that there's some complex logic behind it, right? Especially when it comes to, for example, provided hosted. And we point out, for third-party hosted applications, again, going back to SLA subject and having union SLA, from your SharePoint site to a number, to one or more provider hosted, SharePoint hosted, or other hosted applications deployed and visible in your pages in your site, you now have to think of SLA that's joined across all of them. And someone somewhere has to go out and kind of investigate, okay, we're about to add a provider hosted application to the catalog that will now be exposed to our users, right?
So you might want to think of having a curator, right? Someone that knows the catalog pretty well, knows what's out there, and then we talked at the very beginning about that SharePoint Center of Excellence and the Governance Council. This might be a great topic that every time that curator comes to the council and says, here are the list of apps, here's where I think the gaps are, because there are going to be gaps, and also here are the apps that I think are old. So you continually keep reviewing this, prune it, and decide where to make your investments for the next period.
So at this point in time in App Catalog, if you go there, and we mentioned publish objective criteria for app reviews, when you go to SharePoint Store, you will find reviews, you will find ratings. It helps you. You can sort by them, you can filter by things, right? When you go to App Catalog is essentially a list in one of the sites, and all it shows is some basic information about the app. It does not expose today information, or it doesn't allow to add reviews, it doesn't allow to add ratings. So you have to plan for some sort of extra mechanism that will have that information available for that particular, for App Catalog in general. And speaking of app catalogs, so with app catalogs today, you have, purely from technical perspective, you can deploy one app catalog per web application. What that means is that if you have multiple web apps and multiple forums, you're going to have multiple app catalogs. When you start having multiple app catalogs, the next problem comes along. How do I now essentially synchronize applications? So stepping back and thinking, you really don't necessarily have to synchronize, because you may have legitimate requirements for different web applications and for different apps for SharePoint to be added to different app catalogs. Should you still decide to go ahead and actually add the same application in multiple app catalogs, you have PowerShell commandlets that allow you to export and import app packages from different app catalogs. It doesn't, again, keep in mind, it doesn't really reprovision sites in different environment. All it does, it just takes the XML, the app package, and copies it over to your local disk that allows you later on to import it in different app catalog. From process perspective, this is something you'd have to plan for. A process where an app is added through request, someone adds it, someone then reviews it and says, wait, I have another web application over there. Do they need it? I have my sites over here, I have team sites over there. Is this an application that may be leveraged, that may be used across? If so, I need to add it to another app catalog as well.
So this brings up an interesting point in that, and this was talked about in some earlier sessions. First of all, if you're in Office 365, you only have one farm and you only have one web app. But more than that, when you're on-premise, you might want to think about one of the new kind of models that Office 365 is following. It might make sense for you on-prem as well, is to only have one web app in your farm and try to consolidate everything into one farm. Sometimes that's not possible. There's always going to be times where you might need more, but you might want to start thinking about putting everything back together. SharePoint 2013, that's a lot easier than it was in the past. And it works for Office 365. So
there are a number of sessions that actually talk about MSIT experience, how they've done it internally at Microsoft, and as well as Office 365 experience, how they run things in a single farm or per tenant. So let's go through operations.
So very briefly, we just wanted to touch on what are the things that you have an app out there. What do you care about? What mechanisms are there for you to keep an eye on these things? You have the ability to watch for errors. And we'll show you the screenshot for this. Not only watch for errors, but also try to help give you some information to troubleshoot. But also you have the ability to monitor usage and licensing. So you can figure out, I bought 1,000 licenses for an app. How many are actually being used? As well as usage, we talked about pruning a catalog. How do you figure out whether or not something's in use? So we just have a couple of screenshots briefly to walk you through, just to give you a sense of this is all out there. We just didn't want to tempt the demo gods. So you start out, you choose which apps you want to monitor. You can't monitor an infinite number, but you choose which apps you want to monitor. And from there, you get this kind of status screen. So you see, okay, I have a couple of apps out there. What do they do? One of them is the source is the app catalog. Another one, the source is the SharePoint store. So you can see, did I buy it? Did I build it? You can also take a look at licenses. You can see the one that's from the app catalog, there is no such thing as licenses. In the other one, there is, but it's unlimited. And then you can also see it was installed in 2 places, and you can see from a runtime, these apps are running great. And then again, when you take a deeper dive into this and you click on it, you can see, okay, well, this app is brand new, so it was only deployed once. But you can see right here the usages. This has been launched, it looks like 1 time, and the number of unique users, there was just 1. So this is obviously a demo. For you, you'll see all sorts of different numbers. And then finally, when you do hit errors, this is kind of exposing almost the ULS log to you to take a look at one individual app. So you can see the correlation ID, you can see the location and when it occurred, and get a sense for what's going wrong. So this won't update instantaneously. If users start hitting it, it takes about a day for things to start showing up in here. But once they do, you'll start to see, so if someone comes to you and calls you and says, yesterday I tried to go here and I got this error, what do? Well, you can take a look here and try to see, I see what the actual error message was. I'm going to go back to my developer and try to figure out how to fix this or figure out what configuration setting needs to be changed.
And by the way, purely from usage perspective, information that you saw here is actually stored in usage database. So you can technically access it and actually provide your own spin on it and see a lot more information. So all of that is getting recorded there.
All right, so just to wrap up, again, going back to the session objectives briefly, hopefully this was helpful to give you a start. Again, we joked about it. This isn't the end of your governance discussion. By no means do we claim that we just solved all your governance issues. This is really a place to begin. Everyone's governance is going to be different. Everyone's going to have different requirements. Some people are going to have Office 365 only. Some people are going to have a hybrid. Some people will be on-prem. Everyone has different requirements. So this is the beginning. Hopefully this was helpful to give you a sense of some of the considerations, taking a look at the new app model from a different perspective. And now, questions.
We have 2 microphones. If you'd like to step up and ask questions that way, that will be helpful. Otherwise, we'll just repeat the question. No questions? That's good.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Thanks very much.